بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So the last thing we spoke about, this was 2 weeks ago, we spoke about the miswak, using miswak, and Imam Ghazali, before he begins mentioning the actual method of performing wudu, he talks about miswak, right, because of its importance. So now continuing the discussion of wudu, he says, ثُمَّ اجْلِسْ لِلْوُضُوءِ مُسْتَقْبِلَ الْقِبْلَةِ عَلَى مَوْضِعٍ مُرْتَفِعٍ كَيْ لَا يُصِيبَكَ الرَّشَاشِ. He says, and then sit to make wudu while facing the qibla on an elevated or a raised area or a raised platform, كَيْ لَا يُصِيبَكَ الرَّشَاشِ, so that water does not splash on you. So there is a few things that he mentions over here. Number one, he says, ثُمَّ مَجْلِسْ لِلْوُضُوء. He says to sit down and perform wudu. So rather than standing up and performing wudu, it is regarded as a mustahab to sit down and perform wudu. Therefore, as you see in the Masjid, the ablution area, the wudu area, we have seats. So that is the preferred method of making wudu. So it is mustahab, it is recommended to sit down and make wudu. The second thing he mentions, mustaqbil al-qibla, facing the qibla. So even in the masjid, now obviously because of the lack of space, we can't have every single seat facing the qibla. But there are at least sometimes some seats that are facing the qibla. So you should try sitting on those seats when making wudu that face the qibla. It is mustahab. He then says a third thing, ala mawdi'in murtafi'in. He says the place that you sit should be a bit high. He tells you why. He says kay la yusibaka rashash, so that the water does not splash back on you. Now the reason for mentioning this is because although this is not the most famous opinion, but Imam Abu Hanifa, he held one opinion, this is one of his opinions, that the wudu, the water that falls off the body after making wudu becomes impure. This was one of his opinions. This is not the most famous opinion of his, but one of his opinions was that the water that falls off of your body after making wudu, that water becomes impure. So therefore you should try avoiding getting that water on your clothing. Right? However, the most famous opinion of the scholars is that it's not impure, but water that was already used for wudu once, you cannot use that a second time. So you don't use that same water for wudu a second time. Meaning, for example, if you were to make wudu and all of the water that you used, you gathered in a bucket. So you can't use that water for wudu a second time. So that is something that would not be allowed. However, the water is not impure. You could use that water for other things, but they just don't want you to reuse that water for wudu. Right? And that's why we notice that many times in wudu, for every single thing, you're taking new water. When you're gargling, you're taking new water. You're washing your face, you're taking new water. You're washing your arms, you're taking new water. So they don't want you to reuse the same water over and over again. They want you to take new water. And one of the famous hadith that is mentioned is that when a person makes wudu, then the sins that they committed with that particular area that they're washing, those sins will be washed off with the water falling off of their body. So for example, if a person committed some sort of a sin with their eyes or their mouth, for example, then when you're gargling, right, then that gargling of water is rinsing your mouth, not only physically from any physical impurity, but even spiritually. And then your eyes, when you're washing your face, the same thing. When you're doing masa of the head and you're putting some water into your ears, the same thing. And so this is a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ he mentions. And Interestingly, it's mentioned that the reason why Imam Abu Hanifa, one of his opinions was that the water becomes impure, was because there is a very famous story mentioned about him and other famous pious scholars that they were able to see the sins of a person who was making wudu fall off the body while making wudu. So he says that when I was able to see the sin in the water coming off the body of that person, then how would I be able to say that this water is pure? I can see that there is a sin. The sins are being washed off. So how can that water be pure? Later on, it is mentioned that Imam Abu Hanifa, he disliked this very much, and he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he is no longer able to see such things. Because these are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept hidden, and it is best that we walk around and we think good of other people, and we don't think that this person is committing this sin and this person is committing this sin, rather we think good of them. So Imam Abu Hanifa, he actually made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove this ability of his, that he is able to see the sins. And there are other scholars who also similar incidents are related about them as well. He says, and then at the beginning, obviously everything we begin with Bismillah. So he says, وَقُلْ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ رَبِّي أَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ هَمَزَاتِ الشَّيَاطِينِ وَأَعُوذُ بِكَ رَبِّي أَنْ يَحْضُرُونَ. So he says, say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. O Allah, I seek refuge in you from the whispers of shaitan and from him being present with me. So you say Bismillah and you seek refuge from shaitan, and then you begin your wudu. He didn't mention one thing over here, he's going to mention it later on. According to Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi, it is necessary for you to have an intention when you begin your wudu. You must have an intention. Now the intention does not have to be verbal, right? The intention could just be in the heart, right? That this, for example, a person is making wudu, let's say at 1 o'clock. Most likely this wudu is happening for Dhuhr Salah. Okay? So a person knows in their heart why they're making that wudu. Right? So it is so according to the other scholars, it is recommended to have an intention, but according to Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi, it is necessary, mandatory for you to have an intention. You must have an intention. Without an intention, according to him, the wudu is not valid. Right? So therefore, he's going to mention that. So now he mentions the method of making wudu. So he says, ثُمَّ غُسِلْ يَدَيْكَ ثَلَاثًا قَبْلَ أَن تُدْخِلَهُمَا الْإِنَاءَ. He says, and then you wash your hands. So this is just washing your hands until your wrists. He says, wash your hands 3 times before entering them into the container of water or the bucket of water. Now again, this is something that he's mentioning according to his time, and he's actually using the same words of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have flowing water from taps, but once upon a time, the way they would make wudu is they would have wudu in a container or a bucket, and they would take water from there. So he's saying that make sure that you wash your hands before you enter your hand inside the bucket. Why? Because if there is something dirty on your hands, then you're going to get the rest of the water dirty. So it only makes sense that you wash your hands first before entering them into the bucket. So he's mentioning that. وَقُلْ. And now I mentioned this before, that he's going to mention small du'as with regards to each thing. So when you're washing your hands, read this dua. When you're rinsing your mouth, read this dua. Now again, I mentioned this before, that many of these du'as are not du'as that came from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are du'as that Imam Ghazali is recommending, so that while you're making wudu, you are in constant remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make these du'as so that you're in constant remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while you're making wudu. So he says, and then sometimes what ends up happening is it's actually disliked, it's makruh for a person to talk while making wudu. So if a person is there making wudu and someone is next to them, then in order to keep them from talking to one another, if you're busy reading these du'as, then you're not going to indulge in conversation with another person. So that's also an additional benefit of reading these du'as while making the wudu. So he says, وَقُلْ اللَّهُمَّ إِنِّي أَسْأَلُكَ الْيُمْنَ وَالْبَرَكَةَ وَأَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنَ الشُّؤْمِ وَالْهَلَكَةِ. He says, "Oh Allah, I ask you for a good omen, for good luck and barakah, and I seek your refuge from bad luck and destruction." So you make this dua. He says, make this dua when you're washing your hands. He says, ثُمَّ نُوِي رَفْعَ الْحَدَثِ أَوْ اسْتِبَاحَةَ الصَّلَاةِ. So now he's mentioning to you that don't forget to make the intention. Okay, now the question is that what should your intention be when you're making wudu? So he says one of two things. He says make the intention that you're removing impurity. One intention could be that I'm making wudu to remove impurity. The second is istibahat as-salah, that I'm making wudu so that salah is permissible. Meaning I'm making wudu so that I can perform salah. Why? Because we know that without wudu you cannot perform salah. So have one of these two intentions, that I'm making wudu to become pure, or I'm making wudu for this salah. Why? Because without this wudu I will not be able to perform this dhuhr salah, for example, or this asr salah, or this maghrib salah. وَلَا يَنْبَغِي أَن تَعْزُبَ نِيَّتُكَ قَبْلَ غَسْلِ الْوَجْهِ فَلَا يَصِحُّ وُضُوءُكَ. He says that you must make the intention before washing your face. He says you must make the intention at least before washing your face. So obviously the best thing is you have your intention all the way at the beginning of wudu. That's the best. But he says, what's the latest you can make your intention? So he says the latest you can make your intention is before you wash your face. Why before you wash your face? Because we know that the first fard, the first necessary part of your body that you're going to wash in wudu is your face. The ayah of the Quran, Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu idha qumtum ila as-salah faghsilu wujuhakum. The very first thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, that when you will want to perform salah, faghsilu wujuhakum, then wash your face. So the washing of the face is the first fard. Right? There's for the limbs that we are going to wash in wudu, there are four. There are four limbs that you must wash. Number one is your face. That's fard. Number two, your arms until your elbows, including. Number three, you do masah, you wipe your head. And then the fourth is your feet, up to and including your ankles. So these are the four fard. Everything else that we do in wudu is sunnah. For example, washing your hands at the beginning, that's sunnah. Gargling your mouth, sunnah. Rinsing your nose, your nostrils, sunnah. Doing khilal of the beard, sunnah. And all of these things are sunnah. And washing the face 3 times, that's sunnah. 1 time is fard. So all of the other things that we are doing, they are sunnah. There are 4 things that you must wash, which are fard. Everything else is sunnah. So he says that make sure that you have your intention at least before washing your face. Why? Because that's the first fard. That's the first necessary action. He goes, okay, after washing your hands, what are you going to do? He says, after washing your hands, ثُمَّ خُذْ غُرْفَةً لِفِيكَ وَتَمَضْمَضَ بِهَا ثَلَاثًا. He says, then take water. Ghurfa refers to taking water in your hand. He says, take water in your hand and put it into your mouth and gargle 3 times. تَمَضْمَضَ بِهَا ثَلَاثًا. Gargle 3 times. He says, وَبَالِغْ فِي رَدِّ الْمَاءِ إِلَى الْغَلْصَمَةِ إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ صَائِمًا. He says, and making sure the water reaches the back of your mouth. Meaning when you're gargling, right, you are to put your head back so that you are gargling and the water reaches the back of your mouth. Basically right where the throat begins. So the water should reach back there. He says, except in one condition. If you're fasting, then don't do this. If you are fasting, then don't put the water so far back. Why? Because you don't want to accidentally swallow that water. He's saying if you're fasting, then don't do that. Otherwise, take water all the way to the back of your mouth. وَقُلْ, and now he teaches you another dua. وَقُلْ اللَّهُمَّ عِنِّي عَلَى تِلَاوَةِ كِتَابِكَ وَكَثْرَةِ الذِّكْرِ لَكَ. Oh Allah, help me in reciting your book. Help me recite the Quran. وَكَثْرَةِ الذِّكْرِ لَكَ. And help me remember you a lot. وَثَبِّتْنِي بِالْقَوْلِ الثَّابِتِ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ. And strengthen me with the firm word in this world and the next. Meaning, keep me firm on the kalima in this world and the next. So again, each dua that he's going to mention is going to be somewhat related to that part that you're washing. So we recite the Quran with our mouths, right? So it's a verbal act of worship. So the dua that he's mentioning is similar. That, oh, help me recite the Quran. Help me remember you. Help me recite the kalima and stay firm on the kalima. So he's mentioning, in the dua, he's mentioning things that are similar to that act of worship. ثُمَّ خُذْ غَرْفَةً لِأَنْفِكَ. He says, and then take water for your nose. وَاسْتَنْشِقْ بِهَا ثَلَاثًا. And rinse your nose, blow your nose 3 times. وَاسْتَنْثِرْ بِهَا مَا فِي الْأَنْفِ مِنْ رُطُوبَةٍ. He says that blow your nose and take out whatever mucus or anything that is in your nose and remove any impurities that are in your nose. He says, and when you do this, وَقُلْ فِي الْإِسْتِنْشَاقِ اللَّهُمَّ أَرِحْنِي رَائِحَةَ الْجَنَّةِ وَأَنْتَ عَنِّي رَاضٍ. Again, he teaches you another dua. Oh Allah, bless me with the fragrance of Jannah while you are happy with me. So again, you're washing your nose. So now the dua that Imam Ghazali is mentioning is something that is connected to your nose, smelling. So he said, make it such that I smell the fragrance of Jannah. He says, وَفِي الْإِسْتِنْثَارِ, when you're blowing your nose, then say this, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min rawaihin nari wa min su'id dar. Oh Allah, I seek your protection from the odor and the bad smell of Jahannam. So you're blowing it out. ثُمَّ خُذْ غَرْفَةً لِوَجْهِكَ. So now it's the first form. He says, then take some water for your face. So now he's teaching you how to wash your face. He says, فَاغْسِلْ بِهَا مِن مَبْدَئِ تَسْطِيحِ الْجَبْهَةِ إِلَى مُنْتَهَى مَا يُقْبِلُ مِنَ الذَّقْنِ فِي الطُّولِ ومن الأذن إلى الأذن في العرض وأوصل الماء إلى موضع التحذيف وهو ما يعتاد النساء تنحية الشعر عنه ما بين رأس الأذن إلى زاوية الجبين. So he mentions, he says, okay, where are you going to wash from? So he says, when you take water, he says, take the water, he says, begin washing from where your hair begins to grow, your hairline. So that's the top of your forehead, where your hairline is. He says, wash from here all the way until the bottom of your chin, he says. All the way until the bottom of your chin. So that's in length. He says in width, he says from one earlobe, right, this area, one earlobe to the next. So he says from here, from where your hair grows until the bottom of your chin, from one earlobe to the next. Now, if a person has a very thick beard, right, and their chin is not exposed, right, then it is not necessary for them, right, to get water all the way over here. Rather, wiping this area is sufficient. Right? But he's saying that this is where the face is. From here to the chin, from one side to the other. So this is what you're going to wash. But now, what you need to watch out for is that when you're washing your face, you need to watch out for some of these difficult areas. For example, the inside, right, this part of your eye. Obviously, you don't have to put water inside your eye, right? But this area, right, this area over here. So watch out for this area, right underneath, right in the corner where your eye kind of meets your nose. So watch out for that area, right? And then obviously you're going to close your eyes. So you're going to wash your eyelids, right? Make sure water gets there. So he says that this is where you wash for your face. He says, وَأَوْصِلِ الْمَاءَ إِلَى مَنَابِتِ الشُّؤُورِ الْأَرْبَعَةِ. He says, okay, look, there's hair on your face. There's hair on your face. So now what do you need to watch out for with regards to the hair on your face? So he says, وَأَوْصِلِ الْمَاءَ إِلَى مَنَابِتِ الشُّعُورِ الْأَرْبَعَةِ الْحَاجِبَانِ وَالشَّارِبَانِ وَالْأَهْدَابِ وَالْعِذَارَانِ وَهُوَ مَا يُوَازِي الْأُذُنَيْنِ مِن مَبْدَأِ اللِّحْيَةِ. He says, okay, look. He says, wash these areas and make sure water gets there. He says, make sure water reaches the roots of your eyebrows. Number one, make sure water reaches the roots of your eyebrows. Number 2, he says, make sure water reaches the roots of your mustache. So make sure water reaches the roots of your mustache. Number 2. He says, make sure water reaches the roots of your eyelashes. Meaning, make sure you're getting them over here. You're going over your eyes with your fingers. And he says, make sure you get your sideburns. Because remember, we're washing all the way until our ear. That means this area, the sideburns, is included. This is make sure you wash that area as well. So he says, this is what you must wash. And then he tells you the fifth thing that I told you before. He says that if your beard is not very thick, he says, وَيَجِبُ إِيصَالُ الْمَاءِ إِلَى مَنَابِتِ اللِّحْيَةِ الْخَفِيفَةِ دُونَ الْكَثِيفَةِ. He says that it is mandatory for you to make sure the water reaches your skin, the roots of your beard, the part of it that's on your face. He says, if your beard is thin and not thick. So now the question is, what differentiates? What's a thick beard and what's a thin beard? So basically, what the scholars they mention is that if you can see the skin, so if somebody that looks at you can see the skin underneath, that means your beard is not a thick beard, that's a thin beard. But if you cannot see the skin, then that's a thick beard. So he's saying that, look, if your beard is thick, then you don't need to make sure that water reaches the roots of the beard. Going over it is sufficient. But if your beard is thin, meaning you can see the skin underneath, then you need to make sure that water reaches that area. So now, for example, if you look at me, this part of my beard is thin. That's on my cheek. There's not a lot of hair here. So I would have to make sure that I get water over there. But now, for example, near my chin, that part of my beard is thick. So I don't need to make sure. Now, a person can if they want to. If you want to and you have extra water anyway, then you can really rub and make sure that the water reaches the roots. But he's saying that what is fard? What is necessary for you to do? He says it's only necessary for you to make the water reach the roots if your beard is not thick, if it's thin. So that's one thing to remember. Okay, now what are you going to read? What dua? He's giving another dua. وَقُلْ عِنْدَ غَسْلِ الْوَجْهِ اللَّهُمَّ بَيِّضْ وَجْهِي بِنُورِكَ يَوْمَ تَبْيَضُّ وُجُوهَ أَوْلِيَائِكَ وَلَا تُسَوِّدْ وَجْهِي بِظُلُمَاتِكَ يَوْمَ تَسْوَدُّ وُجُوهَ أَعْدَائِكَ. He says, oh Allah, so again, you're washing your face, so the dua that he mentions is corresponding to this. Oh Allah, make my face radiant with your nur, your light, the day the faces of your friends, the pious people, are radiant. And do not make my face black with darkness the day your enemies' faces will be dark. You're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that through my washing of my face, make my face radiant on the day of judgment. And the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a hadith, he mentions that on the day of judgment, when you come in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, you will be able to see the places that you washed in wudu will be glowing. The places that you washed for wudu will be glowing. So a person's face will be glowing. Their hands, their arms will be glowing. Right? Their feet will be glowing. So all of these areas that you washed in wudu, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that the people will come on the day of judgment, hurran muhajjalin. But they will come and their faces and their feet and their arms will be glowing. So again, you're making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that makes sure that my face glows on that day when the pious people, when their faces glow. He tells you one sunnah. He says, وَلَا تَتْرُكْ تَخْلِيلَ اللِّحْيَةِ الْكَثَّةِ. He goes, look, if you have a thick beard, so if you have a thin beard, then you're going to make sure that water reaches the roots. But what if your beard is thick? Then what do? He says, then don't forget to do khilal. Khilal means to take a wet hand and to go through it. So take a wet hand and to go through it. So take your hand, get it wet, and go through your beard. Right? Go through the sides, right, and go through underneath. So he says that if your beard is thick, then this is what you should do. ثم اغسل يدك اليمنى ثم اليسرى ثلاثا. Right, so now, because the face is just one, he doesn't mention this, but now, because we have two arms, he now mentions, okay, which one are you going to start with? So you're going to start with the right and then the left. So he says, and then wash your right arm and then your left arm 3 times each. From where? He says, from the tips of your fingers until your elbows. And according to majority, including your elbow. So go a bit above the elbow. Right? And many a times we notice that the skin around your elbow is a bit more dry. So you need to watch out for that and kind of rub in the water. Right? Because that area is a bit dry. So he says, now, yes, he then mentions the dua. He says the dua would be Allahumma a'tini kitabi biyamini wa hasibni hisaban yasira. He says when you wash your right hand or your right arm, then you ask Allah, you make this dua. Oh Allah, give me my book of deeds in my right hand. And reckon my actions with ease. He says, and when you wash your left arm, say Allahumma inni a'udhu bika an tu'tiyani kitabi bishimali aw min wara'i dhahri. Oh Allah, I seek your protection that you give me my book of deeds in my left hand or behind my back. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he mentions that the people who did good deeds in this world and who will be successful in the hereafter, Allah will give them their book of deeds in their right hand. May Allah make us from these people. And the people who did not succeed, Allah will give them their book of deeds in their left hand. In another ayah mentions min wara'i dhahri, behind their backs. So we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us in our right hand. Now he didn't mention one thing over here, but when you wash your arms, then just like you made sure that water reached your beard. So you took a wet hand and you went through your beard like this. He says, what do you do for your hands? So because, for example, it will be difficult for water to reach in between your fingers. This is the same thing, you do khilal of the fingers. So you take your hands and you go like this. So you take the left hand and you go over the right hand, and then you take the right hand and you go over the left hand like this, and you make sure water gets in between the fingers. So this is sunnah. ثم استوعب رأسك بالمسح بأن تبل يديك وتلصق رؤوس أصابعك اليمنى باليسرى وتضعهما على مقدمة الرأس. He then mentions the third fard. He says, and after washing your arms, he says, take new water. He says, and then you take your hands and then you do masah of the whole head. So now how do you do masah? So the scholars, they mention that your goal should be, this is what you should try doing. Try doing masah in a way that you're not reusing water. So now how would you do that? The scholars, they mention, for example, so you wet both of your hands. First you take these 3 fingers. You take these 3 fingers on both sides. Keep your index finger and your thumb separate. Take them and start from the front of your head. Go all the way to the back. Go all the way to the back, to your nape, your neck, and then wipe that. And then they mention, come through this. Now use this side. So now use the side that you didn't use yet. Use this side and then come through here. Through this side. Because right now you went over here. Then come this side. Now you've used this side of these fingers and this side. But we didn't use the index finger and the thumb yet. So what are you going to use that for? Your ears. So take your index finger and put them inside your ears. And your thumb will do masah on the outside of your ears. So that way, you're not reusing any water. All the water that you're using to do masah is new water. So this is a method that the scholars, they mention is mustahab, and this is a good way of doing masah. So again, you take your fingers, you go over all the way to the back, and then when you come back, you take this side and you go like this, and then you use your thumb and your index finger and you go like this. So that is a recommended method that the scholars mention, and this is a good way. This is a good way to get your entire head with new water, not water that you're using more than once. Otherwise, if a person just takes water and goes like this, it's still sufficient. It's still fine. Right? But this is a recommended method that the scholars mention is a good way of doing the masah. And then he says, make this dua. Allahumma ghashini bi rahmatika wa anzil alayya min barakatik. Oh Allah, shower me with your mercy. And because it's talking about the head, shower me with your mercy and send your blessings upon me. وَأَظِلَّنِي تَحْتَ ظِلِّ عَرْشِكَ يَوْمَ لَا ظِلَّ إِلَّا ظِلُّ. And give me shade underneath your throne the day there is no shade other than the shade of your throne. And he says, Allahumma harrim sha'ri wa bashari ala nar. He says, Allah, make my hair and my skin haram upon the fire of Jannah. So make this dua. He mentions the last thing, ثم اغسل رجلك اليمنى ثم اليسرى مع الكعبين وخلل بخنصر اليد اليسرى أصابع رجلك اليمنى مبتدئا من خنصرها حتى تختم بخنصر اليسرى. He then mentioned one last thing. He says, now the last thing, the only thing remaining is now to wash your feet. So he says, you're going to wash your feet. How are you going to wash your feet? So he says, you're going to take your foot. You're going to start with the right foot. So you take your foot. He says, you wash it 3 times until including the ankles. He says, and then what do you do? He says, وَخَلِّلْ بِخِنْسَرِ الْيَدِ الْيُسْرَى أَصَابِعَ رِجْلِكَ الْيُمْنَى. He says, then take your left pinky. So take the smallest finger of your left hand and begin doing khilal. But now the khilal of the feet is different. So for the hands, we just went like this. But for the feet, you're going to take your pinky, you're going to start from all the way on the right side. You're going to go through 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you're going to switch to the other right foot. And then you're going to go. So basically, you're going to start. So if this was your feet, you're going to start from here and you're going to end over here. So because that's how you're going to do khilal of your toes. That's how you do khilal of your toes. And he says, and then when you do this, make dua, Allahumma thabbit qadamayya ala sirati yawma tazillu al-aqdamu fi an-nar. Allah, keep my feet firm on the sirat that we cross, right, in the akhirah, right, to get to Jannah. He goes, keep my feet firm on the bridge the day that many people's feet will slip. يَوْمَ تَزِلُّ الْأَقْدَامُ فِي النَّارِ, and they will fall into Jahannam. He says, وَارْفَعِ الْمَاءَ إِلَى أَنْصَافِ السَّاقَيْنِ وَرَاعِ التَّكْرَارَ ثَلَاثًا فِي جَمِيعَ فَعَلَيْكَ. He says, now this last thing that he mentions, he says that if you want and you have the water, he says, take water up until half of your shin. Now this is not fard. The fard is just you wash your feet. Where do your feet end? Your ankles. But he says if you have more water, he says then it is recommended that you do extra and you take it all the way until half of your shin. So take water above. Right? But this is not necessary. And he says that make sure that each thing that we told you before, do it 3 times. Each thing that you do that we told you before, you do it 3 times. Now, according to Imam Shafi'i rahmatullahi alayhi, it is sunnah to do everything 3 times. Everything, including masah. The only difference with the Hanafi opinion is that Abu Hanifa says that you do everything 3 times except for masah of your head. That you only do once. So that's the only difference with regards to the doing it 3 times. So Imam Shafi'i says you do everything 3 times, even masah. Imam Abu Hanifa would say that no, you do everything 3 times, not masah. Masah you just do once. So this is a small difference of opinion between the 2 madhabs. And inshallah we'll continue from here after. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us kama said. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Subhanakallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.